Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our conversations. Today we have Professor Louis Gordon, who is a professor of philosophy and head of department at University of Connecticut in the United States. Professor Gordon has been my mentor and a very good friend of mine. I would easily say that many of the things I think and I do are very related and inspired by the work he has done. So he has many areas of specialization. For example, Africana philosophy, existentialism, philosophy of science, and some of these things we are going to talk about today. His latest book, which has come out from Routledge, is Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization. And I'm sure that this conversation will be of much interest to all of us, especially on the continent where we are talking a lot about decolonization. So welcome, Louis. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Wantia, Dr. Najoya. It's a delight to be here again.
Yeah, I'm still inspired by your work a lot. I keep following it because, like I said, you speak to everyday existence, and that's something that I don't know anyone who does it as well as you do. We've been having a few sort of discussions with my fellow academics and other thinkers, and we've been perplexed about the legacy of colonialism in our work. So last time we talked, you had promised to talk to explain to me what elitism is. So that's the question I'm going to start with. What is elitism? And what is the difference between elitism and expertise?
Okay. Well, the first thing I'd like to say is, and we're going to circle back to it, is when you brought up the legacy of colonialism. One of the things to bear in mind is colonialism is not simply about the extracting of the material resources from a people. It is also about extracting the confidence from a people. It's to convince a people to believe that they're incapable and as a consequence are dependent upon those who have colonized them. And we see it all over Africa, parts of South Asia, parts of the South Pacific and South America, which is, in a nutshell, the belief, simply put, that white is right and the previous colonizers just know how to do things right.
Mm-hmm.
And what's striking about this is said in the face of evidence to the contrary. Now, people would say, what are you talking about? Look how poor people are here, and et cetera, But the thing a lot of people don't bear in mind is that when you take away people's confidence or you convince them they're inferior, they will never look at their strengths and they will never look at the weaknesses of those who dominate them. They will always look at whatever weakness they have and exaggerate it, and look at whatever weakness the previous colonizers have and diminish them. So if we come to the question of elitism, it's related. The first thing to bear in mind, I'll give an example, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I'll give this example is because there's a way people talk about elitism that's very misleading. 20 years ago, when I was teaching at Brown University in the United States, it's an Ivy League university. It's one of the most elite universities in the world. Okay, I was asked to join a group of colleagues to talk about writing. Why professors write. And I was the fifth speaker. So the first speaker began, right?
Mm-hmm.
oh, I hate writing, so forth. I wish I didn't have to do it. Oh my God, why are we forced to do this? Blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
Then the next person, oh, I hate writing, blah, blah, blah. Why do I have to do this? So forth, blah, blah, blah. And it keeps going. There was even a student who in between said, he was from a farm community and here he is in this elite school, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
So it came to me. And I said, one of the things professors do is we teach people to write. I would love to have a person who teaches me to write, who actually loves writing. I loved writing as a child, and whether I'm paid to write or not, I will write because I love it. So, wow, I actually have a job where I'm being paid to do what I love doing.
Mm-hmm.
How does it get any better than that? Whether, and I explained that, writing is a beautiful thing. You communicate with others, with the world, etc. You learn when you write, you research. And I said to the young man who was saying about how he was from a poor farming community and he's in this elite school, I said, nobody forces anybody to go to an elite school. I said, if you really didn't want to be in an elite school, you could have gone to the very local college in your farming community. The truth is, every one of you in front of me, nobody gets into Brown University who did not really use every resource he or she had to get there. And so I said, look, the issue isn't that Brown is an elite university. The issue is what is animating the transition from being elite to elitism.
Mm-hmm.
And we may need to make a distinction between elite and elitism.
Mm-hmm.
Elitism is the belief that if you're at Brown University, you must be better.
Okay.
I taught there. I've seen colleagues there. And I could tell you for a fact, one of the shocking things I did was I was in a faculty meeting with the president. And I said what shocked me at Brown University was the mediocrity of the white faculty. They're not used to black people calling white people that. The man turned tomato red. And the truth is but I brought that up mainly because you see, there are many things we believe about the societies we live in that are false. And one of the false things was that before Black people or African peoples or Polynesian peoples or Dalits or indigenous Southwest Indian peoples, the list is long. Before many women had access to the university, the university actually wasn't based on excellence.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't know this. In the past, the way most people got academic jobs was their mentor would just call up somebody and say, hey, hire this person. And it used to be guys, white guys.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll say, okay, because they, and if the person wrote something great, if the person didn't, so what?
Mm-hmm.
That's not excellence. Now, some people in there loved knowledge, loved what they were doing, and they worked from excellence. Those are the ones who became the Halle, the Newtons, the Kant, the Hegels, but the truth is, those are a tiny group of people. If universities and schools depended on the most extraordinary people teaching them, we'd never be able to function. So the truth about most institutions, that's where we have to begin, right? Is that they're not based on excellence. They're based on adequacy. In other words, somebody who's competent enough to do the job. Okay? That's just a fact. People will say all kinds of things. Claim it's otherwise, but it's not true. That's why I often have to remind my female students that the women they often meet as professors sometimes are the very first women ever in all of history to have taught in their institutions.
Mm-hmm.
You have experienced that. You saw that at Penn State and other
Mm-hmm.
places. So that's the first thing. However, although those may be the very first, we have to bear in mind that these few women, few people of color, etc., once we began to come into the system, they suddenly had to account for themselves. So they began to create inflated standards that they didn't have to meet, the people who preceded us.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of us, the first generations, the early generations to enter these institutions, we were held by such a higher standard that the only way we could have access was through, not all of us, but most of us, having to perform extraordinarily high. So we depended on excellence just to get into the room. Okay? That's the double standard. Now, so once we understand this, we also have to understand that a story I just told is only part of a story. Because the story I just told is the story, I'm using the university as an example, of the university as understood over the past 500 years. What many people, especially many in the audience, may not know is that there were higher institutions of learning. I don't like to say university. I prefer to say learning and research communities. Learning and research communities where people go to learn and continue learning actually go back more than 3,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
And they were in South Asia and in East Africa. Okay. So many in the audience, I know when I started the story about the university and so forth, I know in their heads they thought of the British University, the French, but those are latecomers.
Mm-hmm.
So why do I bring this up? Well, here's the thing. Our species has revolutions, great moments of change through excellence. But the thing about it is you don't start with the sentence, I will be excellent. Actually, you don't know what you will be. But if you do what you love doing, you may discover one day something that will help so many in our species. So here's the thing. It is impossible. It's just impossible for all human beings to be interested in the same thing. It's just impossible. But those who are most interested in some things, when they put the extra time, they can do it in a way that few people can. And it's just impossible to have high levels of achievement without creating an elite. It's just impossible. But that's not elitism. That's just an elite. If there are people who are, I was watching a wonderful film the other day. I love this film. I recommend it to all my students to watch. It's a Bollywood film. It's called Three Idiots.
Oh yeah, yeah, I've watched it too. Yeah.
It's an amazing film, but there's a
Mm-hmm.
great moment in the film when they were sitting on a step drunk where Rancho, the charismatic character, said to the other two, you're not doing well because you're not doing what you love doing. You're not following your passion.
Mm-hmm.
He said, could you imagine if Muhammad Ali decided to be a singer and Michael Jackson decided to be a boxer?
uh,
And so his point is, he said he was being an engineer because he loved being loved
mm-hmm.
engineering. You love you love ideas. That's why you studied French, but you didn't study French to fetishize French people. It
Mm-hmm.
gave you access to Francophone Africa. It gave you access to people like Frantz Fanon, people all the way through Pauline Otunji, Leopold Senghor, Sheikh Anta Diop, it's the Saar sisters, so many others. So the thing is, when we do our work really well, it opens doors for ourselves and others. That's, but now we come into elitism. You see, there is a form of elite that that is not about talent. There's a form of elite that's about, for instance, traditions or simply theft, and that is the wealthy elite. If you're born into a rich family, you have not done anything except pop up. And so, in a way, inherited wealth is always, always unjust. And this may sound like a shocking statement to make, because you could say, what if the person who acquired the initial wealth got it justly and gave it to you? That still doesn't make it just. What makes it just is what you do with the inherited wealth. You see? If you realize you don't have much talent, but you generate it to those who do, then perhaps your talent is generosity. Perhaps, and if we go back to the elite school I was teaching in, there were people who had very good grades, went through all kinds of things, but there were people who were just children of rich people who got access, same to Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, etc. There are people who just, without their actual performance, receive the resources. But then this brings us back into something important. You see, colonialism and racism are also forms of narcissism. What they are, white supremacy is an example. White supremacy is to stack all the decks in favor of white people and then convince every individual white person that she or he did it on his or her own. That is, right? The problem with that narrative is that it is not only false, but it's damaging. And here's why it's damaging. Because, you see, first, here's the fault. Well, here's why it's false. Human beings are creatures who depend on each other to make things happen. That's our power. There's no such thing as anybody who succeeds without mentors, a community helping them, a social world. I sure haven't. My mentors, my mother, my father, my cousins, my grandmother, my family, my best teachers, all of those people contributed to what we call Lewis Gordon. That's why my books always have long acknowledgments, because it's just true. However, if I convince myself I don't need anybody, I'm like a god. I just need to snap my finger and things will happen. If I come and read a book, I will make it bring something better to it than anybody else. That is the narcissism. And that is what elitism as a category taps into. It's to convince a group of people or an individual that he or she is deserving regardless of performance. And so it means that you look for the outcome before the performance and the rewards, even without the performance. Now, what's tricky is, even though I'm using academic examples, I could use many others, you see. I have a great plumber. And when he would come, what was great about him as a plumber is not only how well he knew his job, but I loved the fact that every time he came to work on the house, he would teach me. That's because he loved plumbing so much. He wanted everybody to learn how. So a lot of times when things would break down, I would fix things and call him when it's beyond my expertise. You see what I'm getting at? So in my house, I'm at best a handyman, but he is an expert. So when I call him, he is in what we would call properly an elite group of plumbers because of his excellence. It's the similar thing with foods. There are people who could cook, but there are people who can cook.
Mm-hmm.
When
Yeah.
when you taste their food, it's like the gods come out
Yeah.
and coat your tongue. And the list is on. Their teacher
Yeah.
is true, but they're people who make people grow. They're
Mm.
excellent teachers. That's an elite community of teachers, but they're not elitism
Mm-hmm.
because they're committed to everybody growing, you see? So democracies, this is where it comes in. Democracies take the
Mm-hmm.
position that people should govern themselves. So they don't see governing as an elite project, right? But elitism is the position that there's certain people independent of their performance who should be the ones who govern. And elitism, unfortunately, leads to a situation of being governed by mediocrity. Excellence comes in governing when people have to put in the time to learn how their society function, play their part, learn from their mistakes, and build on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so democracy is always anti-elitism, but a
Mm-hmm.
democracy needs elites to function well.
Mm-hmm.
What it needs, though, are elites whose elite status are a function of the excellence of their performance. So that's why healthy democracies need scientists, need artists, need people who are good with food. It needs good farmers. It needs people who take pride in keeping streets clean. A good democracy needs caring people, people who know how to take care of children, who are able to build good schools, etc. Because democracies, right, are about, and here's something else democracies need. Democracies need people to be excellent at speech, because democracies depend on people speaking together to learn how to govern.
Mm-hmm.
And once we have that, the governing that's created from democracy tends to have the more political end. Politics is about speech, but governing is about rule. But if the people are going to rule themselves, the people need intelligence. And intelligence requires the critical reflection of speech and a commitment to continued learning.
Mm-hmm. So, there's somewhere in your upcoming book where you talk about um, professions being linked to whiteness, and you are giving an example from Jamaica that the professionals tended to be the lighter skinned people of the community. So how would you link elitism to race, and especially when you're dealing with the colonial situation? Because the difficulty about talking about elitism, which is why I asked you about it, is because our rulers are Africans. We are supposedly an independent country, and yet the form of elitism that we experience feels very colonial English. So what exactly is happening in that dynamic? And also, um, you know, can you also comment on the on elitism and access to colonial institutions? So for us, for example, in Kenya, it's dependent on your grades. Okay, now it is becoming less and less dependent on grades and passing through the elite schools. Now it's becoming more and more about where were you born and to whom you were born. But there's still an element of, if I went to this school and I did very well, it means that anything I do is necessarily excellent and I don't have to put in any time. So what is that colonial dynamic in African independent, so-called independent nations, and how is it linked to racism? Yeah.
Well, I think one of the best discussions of this was from Frantz Fanon in Le Dernier de la Terre, The Damned of the Earth, or many listeners may know it as The Wretched of the Earth. And what Fanon pointed out is that a big mistake happens in many post-colonial states, okay? The mistake, he argues, is that they fought a struggle in which many of the freedom fighters, many of the decolonizers, the people who are trying to fight for independence, did not fight for a revolution. They fought actually simply to replace the colonizers. So they fought to change the players, but not the game. If you look at many countries in Africa, but not only in Africa, in Asia and in South America, when independence occurs, at certain basic cultural levels, there's nothing that people want more than to be part of the global community. So for instance, I'll give you an example. When I was there's a tiny community that it used to be a former, what they call township, that I would spend time in when I was teaching in Makanda or Grahamstown. And when I went up to a high school there, a secondary school, and it was a very poor secondary school, broken glass, all kinds of things. And I looked at pictures of the graduating classes. And if you look at the pictures of the graduating classes up until 1994, the graduating class would have to pose for the pictures dressed in stereotypical traditional clothing of what supposedly Africans would wear. These were predominantly Xhosa people, but it could be Zulu and others. And the girls, these are adolescents who are about to go to university, would be standing up with their breasts out, and the guys would be holding spears and etc. And I'm not saying that people have to be ashamed of any history like that. That's not my point. What I found interesting was the graduating classes picture the year after the elections. The same secondary school, the girls were all dressed the way they would if they were going to the best party you could imagine, or to church, or whatever they do. They had their hair done. They were wearing their best dress. The men were wearing their best suits. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And that is because these people are not African people from the 5th century AC. These were 20th century African people.
Mm-hmm.
And they're inspired by African people all over the world, whether they're in the Caribbean, in South America, whether they're Africans in another African country, Zambia or wherever, or Kenya, you see?
Mm-hmm.
And similarly with foods, a lot of the foods that people would begin to eat, they're pizzerias. They would eat, people eat tomatoes. Tomatoes are not indigenous to Africa. Potatoes are not indigenous to Africa. These are all things that are part of world trade. So, and then music, they began to produce, they were playing African jazz, African hip hop, African rock and roll, and also there are different kind of music that evolved in Africa. As we know, if you look in Nigeria, Fela with, Afro funk and all of that stuff. So my point is this, right? The reason they do this is because they are 20th, and now you, for instance, are a 21st century African woman. Now, everything you're wearing right now is a creolization or a hybrid of things connected to being Koyo, to being Kenyan, to being an educated woman, to being a person who's urban, the whole list, and the designs. In other words, you're doing what fits you. And your sister, I know your sister, she does what fits her. Look at the way I am. I am comfortable. A lot of people think my hair is this way for Rastafari, but it isn't. You already know I'm a Black Jewish person, and naturally in Judaism, we don't cut our hair. Okay, and there are lots of other things. So that I'm comfortable with. If I were uncomfortable with it, I'd look very funny. It's always funny when I see guys who try to do their hair like mine, but they're not really comfortable. So they go to hairdressers and they make themselves look pretty and they walk around. It's silly. I do it because this is part of the community I'm from, who I am. But at the same time, I'm wearing this blazer. And it's not to be like a white guy or anything. It's comfortable, it's warm, etc. So what this tells you is we bring meaning to culture. Now, here's the problem. At independence, the universities remain the same.
Mm-hmm.
The governing systems, parliamentary style, remain the same. You have people in Kenya who are wearing white powdered wigs.
Yeah.
It's stupid. You have the economy remains the same.
Mm-hmm.
And the list goes on.
Mm-hmm.
Even the religious institutions,
mm-hmm.
they're not being questioned. They're just being the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, whatever. Those things didn't go through the same transformations that food and music, etc. went through. So they're based on two fallacies. The first one is one size fits all, ahistorically. The second fallacy is the absence of critique. The university imagines that it was independent of the colonial system, when in fact, it was designed by and for the colonial system.
Mm-hmm.
And so that form of university, if it imagined itself as independent, it meant in the post-colony, it doesn't have to change.
Yeah.
So it continues teaching the same racist books, the same patterns that misrepresent history. And so here, I just gave one example earlier of a misrepresented history, which is that institutions of higher learning began in Europe. That is false. There are lots of other misrepresentations. For instance, most people imagine when they open their Bible that their ancient people walking around, Adam and Eve, as some white people. That's just false. You know, white people, white-looking people, did not exist on this planet until approximately 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Yeah, human beings, Homo sapiens, were all dark. Evolved 220,000 years ago on the African continent. And for approximately 210 to 214,000 years, were my color, your color. A lot of people don't know this about Africans, right? But you've traveled across the continent, so you know this. The most genetically diverse people on the continent are Africans.
Mm-hmm.
And not just at the level of our genes, morphologically. You know that there are Africans with no mixture with white people, who are light, who are very dark, who are short, who are tall, who are thick, who are skinny. One of my favorite things to do when I go to certain parts of Africa where many Africans would meet in certain universities, because, you know, people send their children, the students come from all over the continent. I used to love to just stand in the courtyard of an African university and just watch the people. I wish many African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans could have that experience, and just seeing the rich diversity. Even when I'm in Nairobi, when I'm downtown sometimes, just sitting and just looking at the range of women and men, diverse. And so the thing is, to understand the damage done from failing to address this notion of white supremacy, whites dominating the globe only exists, it's only been around a few hundred years.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize this. And for the listeners to get a sense of this, I'll tell you a story. W.B. Du Bois, the famous African-American philosopher, theorist, sociologist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When he was teaching at Atlanta University at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th, he invited Franz Boas, who was a Jewish German physicist who became an anthropologist. He wrote against racism. He invited Franz Boas to come and speak for the graduating class at Atlanta University, which was a Black university. And he wanted Boas to speak on race and racism. And Boas said, you know, Black students are educated and intelligent. They can read. He said, I want to talk about something else. And Du Bois said, what do you want to talk about? He said, I want to talk about African history. And Du Bois was shocked. Because remember, the Du Bois we know today was not the same as the young Du Bois. The young Du Bois really believed that nonsense, that the colonization, the enslavement of Africans brought African people into civilization by whites. And he, as a graduate of Harvard, et cetera, was an educated, civilized Black man. And his job and the fellow Black Americans' job was to civilize the rest of the Black race. He believed that. And Boas said, look, he said, so Du Bois said, what do you mean African history? And Boas said, well, because by then they're discovering all this. He said, look, humanity has been around more than 200,000 years, and most of it was on the African continent. And the Europeans, the whites having domination, that has only been around a few hundred years. But let's look at the achievements that humanity had up until a few hundred years ago. First of all, humanity almost died out because there were other hominins, but Homo sapiens survived. We had gone down to a tiny group because of our intelligence. We invented trade, we invented makeup, we invented language, we invented smelting iron, bronze. The list goes on. There were ancient African cities. There was everything from figuring out how to ferment to create alcohol that was used as antiseptics. There was everything from baking of bread to beer, to brewing beer, which is used for many things. There were physicians, there were medical techniques, and this is one of the reasons why Homo sapiens very early on became large communities. Then all along East Africa, there you could see the remains all the way from ancient civilizations, from Aksum, the varieties in Nubia, all the way to Kemet. Then he goes all the way through to just so many things that were being done. Ships, sailing. That's why there were Africans all the way through to what we call West Asia, all the way through to India, all those places. Those waves of Africans who went all the way through to what we know today as Australia, all the way through to South America. There were everything from the comb to techniques for what to do for surgery, eyes, the list is long. All of this at a time when there were no white people. And one of the things that led to the transformation, to what we call white people, was the revolution in agriculture. You see, when humanity was eating mostly meat, we had sources of vitamin D, and when we ate mostly fish. But once we became more agrarian, if you're in the southern areas, you have a sufficient amount of sun, so the vitamin D required darker skin. But in the northern areas, once you go to a more vegetarian diet, you don't get sufficient vitamin D, and people got to get lighter because it is just a fact. You know, that's the best way to get enough UV rays to get vitamin D. Now, here's the thing. What we call those ancient white people were not white people. They were just light-skinned Africans or light-skinned Homo sapiens. However, Northern Europe is a very difficult environment. It went through periods of ice ages, and there were periods where marauding groups of Europeans began to take to the seas. And you could see in a lot of ancient African literature, they were known as the sea peoples. And a lot of them ended up in parts of North Africa, in parts of West Asia, among people like the Phoenicians and other groups. But every time they did this, they were coming into environments in which Africans weren't walking around, you know, dumb and unaware of reality. These African communities are encountering had large cities, you know, big mausoleums for the dead, all kinds of resources. As Rosina Mart and many others would say, you don't go colonize people who have nothing. You raid people because they have something you need, something you want. So we come now to the period that led to amnesia. You see, the period we're talking about, the past 500 years, you know, one of the things you have to bear in mind is the people who tend to dominate the writing of history of the past 500 years have been white. But what they misrepresent in the history is the very understanding of African peoples. You see, most stereotypes of African peoples who were kidnapped from the African continent and enslaved is of the stereotype of people walking around in the jungle and get snatched away. That is false. The people who were snatched away were skilled laborers. They were people with expertise. They were physicians, they were architects, they were farmers, they were midwives, the list is on, they were astronomers, etc. That skill set was brought to North America, to Europe, to South America, to Central America. And that is why those places grew, they boomed, okay? And once we understand those people as skilled laborers, we need to rethink colonial and African history. In addition to that, a lot of the complex states, the societies, the systems in Africa were subject to ongoing conflicts, wars, their economies undermined, and many other things that led to what Walter Rodney in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa called underdevelopment. Many Africans don't know African history, just like Du Bois didn't know African history. Many things that Africans had that were invented by Black people and Africans in the consciousness of everyday Africans was invented by a white person. The light that we're using in the technology right now, or the light that's out in my room, was invented by an African diasporic man. All right, the filament for the light bulb, it wasn't Thomas Edison. The cotton gin that affect the cotton in the clothes you're wearing wasn't invented by Eli Whitney, it was by an enslaved African. Many of the techniques that we have learned, that were given to us supposedly by the European, were actually learned by the European from Africans. And it's not that Europeans never invented anything. I don't want to create a kind of holier than thou exceptionalism. The true story is that all human beings invent things to make our lives better. But it's just false to think, and this is the racism, the narcissism, and the elitism. It's false to think that there's something intrinsic in white people that makes them able to invent and make things better, and something intrinsic in Black people and Africans that make us fail or incapable. That is false. And what a lot of the viewers may not know, it's not just about the story I just told of what colonizers learned from the people they colonized, but it's also part of the narcissism. Everybody, what a narcissist does when somebody else is doing something well is not to say, oh, wow, teach me that. A narcissist gets pissed off and destroys it because the narcissist view is, if I'm not the one who did it, nobody should have it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, many periods in history in the past 500 years, when enslaved people and when African peoples are excelling, there were whites, were colonizers who would go in and destroy them. Okay? Part of that destruction is to convince the people of their incapacity. And so if we want to see a simple summary, a lot of Black people fight because we want to breathe. We want to have some room. We want to make our lives better. But sadly, a lot of white dominated racist societies fight to maintain inequality, to make sure others cannot breathe, to dominate them. And it's not all white people do this, but unfortunately, the historical record shows that a lot do,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And even, but, you know, as I said, not all, because Franz Boas wasn't Black, or John and Jean Komaroff. That analysis I gave was also from their book of Revelation and Revolution, where, you know, where they're white Jewish South Africans, but they wrote that it's incorrect to think that colonizers simply knew everything. The process of colonization was that the colonizers were learning from the colonized. Because what the hell did white people in Europe know about malaria? What the hell? What in the world did the white people in Europe knew about keeping their skin moisturized? What in the world, and the list goes on, what in the world did they know about certain agricultural techniques that would work in the African continent? And what created a lot of starvation and a lot of disruption of African economies was the imposition of European techniques on them. Because you see, historical African farming was predominantly done by women. It was done through an understanding of rotating crops. It was done by a lot of techniques that today people are learning were actually correct. And it was also based on an idea of what proper nutritional needs are. If you do monocrops, you're going to have unhealthy people because everybody's just eating one kind of food. But if you have variety, and if you eat in modest amounts, you'll have people who are not suffering from diabetes and obesity and all kinds of other things. But you have people who have a varied, vitamin-rich, healthy diet. It's the same thing with knowledge. People shouldn't only be learning one thing. They should be learning many things. They should be multilingual. They should be learning about what is involved in how to make a home function. They should be like my attitude to the plumber or to the people who fix things in my house. Whenever they walk into my house to fix something, I am their student. I may be a professor, but at that moment, I'm a student. Why? Because they know more about this than I.
Yeah, we have an electrician like that. It's so fascinating when he comes to repair things that he teaches us how things work, why things are not working, what needs to be done. And there's a particular problem. He said that he has to go and think about it and come up with a solution. It was so exciting. But unfortunately, especially in Kenya, we have a differentiation of value, of expertise. We think that certain expertise in certain subjects is more valuable than expertise in others. So what is the process by which we arrive? Is it elitism, as you've explained, or what is it that makes us devalue the expertise and the work of some and elevate the mediocrity of others in the name of, for example, quality?
Well, this is where it relates to what you said about coloniality or colonialism, you see?
Mm,
Because all colonialisms take the form of an elitism, but what it does is that it depends on a lie, you see? Everything I've been talking about so far is about what happens when people lie to you,
mm,
see? For instance, it is simply a lie to take the position that there are some people by virtue of their color or their place of birth that are intrinsically inferior to other people. That's just a lie. It's also a lie that Black people are not really human beings, because all racism requires identifying human beings and then claiming they're not human beings.
mhm,
But that means that you have to know they're human beings, which means you're lying. So once we understand this, what we also have to understand is that for lies to work, they must tap into something uh, that many of us may fear or desire, you see? And the truth about human existence is that human existence is very difficult. What we are creatures that diverged from being. You see, if we were just part of the landscape, if we were like other animals, then life would be easy. You just simply eat, sleep, and avoid becoming food.
mhm,
That's pretty
mhm.
that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Mhm,
but the moment we were able to raise the question of possibility, we live in a world where we depend on language, communication, understanding. And that makes us responsible for our existence. Right? We're not beings, really. We are the possibility of beings. And so that enormous responsibility makes us live in a world of meaning. And because of that, um, the human, our world is one in which we're only partially in control. We're never fully in control. And if you're never fully in control, you know what that means? No human being is ever safe.
mhm,
And so some people are so afraid of not having guaranteed safety that they would rather be independent on the enemy they know than the possibility of an enemy they don't know. But that is the mistake. They think of the world in terms of enemies and friends. Another possibility is to say it's not about enemies or friends. It's about working together to increase the options through which we can live more meaningful lives.
mhm,
And a more meaningful life is not predictable. A good example is, I know this about you. You're a married woman. But you could never, ever, ever have predicted un- until the day it came when you and your husband decided to marry each other, that this would have been the man you would marry. You may have even made a decision at one point that you weren't going to get married because you've seen a lot of terrible men in the world.
Mm.
You don't know. And that's the whole point. You see, our existence is precarious. It depends upon every day an act of faith
Yes.
in the possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Other animals don't think about faith. Faith is part of our existence. You don't know when you get up every morning who will live, who will die.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know when you get up every morning if it'll be a good day or a bad day.
Mm.
But you start your day.
Mm-hmm.
So if we come back to this, the seduction of elitism is that it claims predictability.
Oh, yeah.
It promises you supposedly that the best people are the people who went to the best schools,
Mm.
that the best people are the people from this neighborhood versus that neighborhood, that the best people are the people who are this skin color versus that skin color. And the list goes on and on. But none of that is true. None of that is true. The truth of the matter is we're born each day simultaneously with ignorance and knowledge. The knowledge we have is from the day what preceded us. The ignorance we have is of what to come. And in there, we have to work at making things work. I could never, ever, ever have predicted the person to whom I'm married. I could never have predicted the face of my children. Other people could, in the sense that they'll say, well, they'll look like you or her.
Mm.
But anybody in a family know that we always think we look very different from each other.
Yeah.
But there are lots of things we could bring. I would never have predicted where I live now. Lots of things require courage to live our lives. I remembered when I decided to go get my PhD. I was a secondary school teacher in New York City. I was a very successful secondary school teacher. I created a school for young people nobody wanted to teach. They were so difficult to teach that I was told that if 10% of them would finish secondary school, it would be a successful program. We had an 85% success rate.
Wow.
So you could
Yeah.
imagine the assistant principal wanted me to stay.
Mm-hmm.
But when I learned that we had to give a study of the program, and I realized that, why were those students successful? Because their lives were miserable. They had horrible lives, difficulty. But I realized that our program was a program every day when they walked into that room, they walked in as human beings. And it struck me, every human being knows she or he is a human being. Why is it that when you treat people like human beings, they grow? And when you don't, they wither? And I wanted to look into human potential. So I decided to go to graduate school. But the assistant principal said to me, what are you going to graduate school for? Don't you know there are PhDs driving cabs? That's what he said to me.
Oh, wow.
And this is a white man. And you could imagine, I'm a black man. How
Mm.
many black PhDs do you see around? And so I looked at him and I said, well, then I guess I'd be a very educated cab driver.
Mm.
And he looked at me with shock. Because you remember, all I knew is I loved learning. I wanted to learn. I did not, and I knew the world, and the academy is very racist. So I had no reason to expect when I went to graduate school that I would become a professor. All I knew, and my mother always said the same thing, always keep getting educated. You don't know what it'll lead to. but you have a better understanding of life and you're more free as a human being, the more educated you become. So I went to graduate school to get an education. It wasn't just about certification. I would get the PhD, but I was there to learn. So it meant because of that passion, and you already know this, I wrote more than other people. I studied more than other people. And before I knew it, at a very young age, I was a very well-known academic. But I didn't expect that. My plan was to go back to New York City and teach, maybe in the teaching colleges, etc. I knew I was a good teacher. That I knew because of what happened with those young people in that secondary school. I knew I was a good teacher. What I didn't know is that I was also a good researcher. And this goes back to the early story. The reason I didn't know that is because, you see, I did not know enough yet to know that if you love writing, really love writing, you also love learning. And all research is to continue learning. So that made me actually have a person with the right skill set for this profession. So I did become a very successful academic. But the point is, I went to it with respect for people who are cab drivers. My uncle works cab drivers. I never, ever step into a cab with condescension to a cab driver. I learn a lot from cab drivers. We have conversations about cities. Every country I've been in, whether it's in in Kenya, or in Ireland when I'm in Dublin, or whether I'm in Dakar, Senegal, or whether I'm in Salvador, Brazil, I learn from cab drivers, and so because of going to education without the elitism is about the certificate. It's like walking around with medals. But acquiring knowledge, we don't even realize that as a species, we're a species that really depend on our intelligence. I mean, human beings are physically very weak creatures. A chimpanzee is stronger than 4 grown men. You know? You know what I mean? And let's face it, anybody, even a wild hare, a rabbit, or, a lot of people today don't understand wild animals. You know what I mean? Because for them, even a small wild animal is fighting for its life. They are stronger than we are.
They are.
But we depend on intelligence. But unfortunately, when humanity used our intelligence for approximately 200 and, I don't know, 219,500 years, a lot of it was connected to understanding that we're custodians of a planet. But narcissism says it's all about me, 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 me. And white supremacy and colonialism is selfish, are selfish. And the damage done to not just Black people and Africans, but to the planet over the past 500 years is horrific. We need to start using our intelligence, not simply about going against the elitism that leads to mediocrity of governance, but we also have mediocrity of taking care of the planet. Right now, these authoritarian leaders, whether it's Trump, it's not all over yet. I mean, we're trying to get this wacko out, but in Bolsonaro's in Brazil, Modi in India, we see these idiots in the UK. The list is long. And in African countries too, we see what happens with the turn to the right in Tanzania. Ironically, African countries were handling COVID-19 better than the rest of the world. But if you look carefully at the ones that are having trouble, they're the ones that are most emulating the right-wing countries of Europe and North America. And that tells you something. We right now need to use our intelligence holistically. We need to understand that life on our planet depends on our using our intelligence for life instead of for extraction.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And now that you've mentioned these right-wing people, they also have a discourse against elites. What is the difference? How do you distinguish what you have explained about the difference between elites and elitism? What is it that the conservatives are against?
Okay, one of the best books on this subject was written by Ortega y Gasset.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Spanish philosopher and politician in the 1930s. And he makes a distinction between democracy and massism. Okay?
Mm.
The distinction, you notice, I have nothing against elites, because as long as a person's elite status is a function of excellence, my response is that we need excellence. So I have no reason. However, massism is based on what's called ressentiment, or right? It's a form of resentment that is so focused on the self that there's a form of rage against others for excelling. All massism has a mentality that it's indecent to excel or stand out.
Mm.
So it's
Yeah.
right. So it's anti-elite, but it's ironic and paradoxical, because it's anti-elite, but it sneaks in elitism. The elitism becomes the group who claim to be anti-elite. So it's always right wing, because the elitism is premised on the idea of deserving everything without performance. And in other words, it's the group who see it almost as their birthright. And so what happens is, it usually starts with saying the problem with the world is that there are people who create insecurity, disruption, or dissent. So you need to get rid of them. So it usually takes the form of imagining a perfect past. But the perfect past they imagine is pure and homogeneous. So the right wing always imagines a past when things were perfect, but it means that it's these imperfect people who come in and mess things up. But then anything people do to distinguish themselves becomes a threat to that system. So it often begins with xenophobia.
Mm-hmm.
Then it moves into a kind of attitude against minority groups. Then it gets into a claim of being anti-elite, because, of course, it's impossible to be excellent at something without distinguishing yourself, whether it's as an artist or cook. So it's against that. Then it eventually goes against gender, because the idea is that it becomes right when men were in charge and that kind of stuff. And then before you know it, then once they begin to knock away everybody, then it becomes within their own group who is different. So that is a so-called anti-elitism, but it's actually against difference, you see? So it leads to a kind of homogeneity, a kind of monism, a kind of singularity. Everybody must be the same. But the thing we have to bear in mind is that to be equal and to be the same are not identical. You see?
Mm.
You could be equal, but not the same. And a healthy form of elite society has equals. Those equals are called the people or the citizens, whatever language you use. But they don't have to be the same. They could distinguish themselves by their talents because we need those talents as a community. However, the other group, that turn to the right, they're anti-elitism. They take the position, they're actually against equality, but they're for sameness. You see the distinction?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So any moment you distinguish yourself, you must be eliminated.
Oh, and oh dear, here in Kenya, there's a distaste from of the ruling class against people who stand out. And in fact, life is it's so violent. If you stand out in any way, you're crushed and called proud and elitist. It's so interesting. So I always had a difficulty trying not to be elitist, but saying we need some form of excellence and to acknowledge when people put in the work and are good at something.
Well, Fanon, whom I mentioned earlier, he brought up this issue dialectically. Remember, I said that Fanon said the mistake of many independence movements is they simply want to replace the colonizers. The problem there, Fanon pointed out, is that every group of people who ascend into rule, who become the rulers, depend upon legitimacy. But the way the people who bring in the independence movement gain their legitimacy was through violence. What Fanon argued is, that their job is to get rid of colonizers. Okay. Now, when I said violence here, some of the violence could have been like wars, with weapons, but we have to remember that all settlers, all colonizers believe they have the right to the land they've colonized. So if you take it from them, they're going to see that as an injustice, as an act of violence. So even if you didn't blow them up or shoot them or torture them, the fact that they have to give up the land is for them an act of violence. Now, here's the thing. The people now at the moment of independence who have the legitimacy, they say, look what I have done. I've gotten rid of the colonizer. I am legitimate. Fanon says, now you're in trouble. You think it was bad before. But I'm going to give an example from the Bible, because a lot of people don't think of this as a political story, but it's a beautiful political story. Among Jews, we call it Torah, okay? But Christians know of Moses. What many Christians don't know is that Moses didn't enter the promised land. Moses was told that he could go up on a mountain and look at it, but he wasn't to enter. And then eventually, God also told Moses when he would die. And it's a very interesting death. The Hebrew account is that the angels came, dressed Moses properly. God came down and kissed him. That kiss took away his life, and Moses left with God. Now, here's the important part. Why this story? Well, could you imagine if Moses entered the promised land?
He would be a tyrant.
Correct. How can anybody stand up to Moses?
Nobody.
If you said, you know, Moses, maybe we should try this, Moses would take the tablets and say, yo, I'm Moses.
Do you know how we got here?
Yeah, you kiss my feet. Be grateful to me. You don't want Moses in the promised land. Now let's look at the post-colonial states.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the heroes and heroines, there were women too, who got rid of the colonizers. Their skill set, we've been talking about skill sets. Their skill set was the skill set of getting rid of colonizers. That's what they knew. They grew up in colonialism and they knew how to fight it. But here's the problem. What about after colonialism? You see, if their legitimacy depends on telling the people they know how to fight colonialism, then they could only continue their legitimacy through the ongoing fight against colonialism, which means their dependency depends upon keeping the people in a colonial mentality.
Wow.
What Fanon said very poetically is that every generation has its mission to fulfill or betray. The generation who fought against the colonizers, that was their mission. But eventually there are people who are not born under European settlers. Eventually there are people who are born in a society where the people who represent authority are fellow Africans, fellow Black people, fellow, if it's a multiracial society, Blacks, Africans, East Indians, small sets of whites, whatever, like Kenya, right? And what Fanon was saying when I used that example of embracing new ideas, new cultural resources, create Kenyan ways of doing things, you see, that requires a new generation, which means dialectically, they now have to overcome the ruling group who created independence. So the message is those people have to understand, they have to be like Moses. They have to step back and let the next generation rise. And so the task of every generation is a paradoxical one. It's to achieve with humility. The humility is to understand that you're not a god or a goddess. You're to achieve enough with enough room for others to take the mantle of achievement and build it in what fits them. You see? And too many people are looking to imitate those who preceded them rather than to transform their society to what it needs. One good example that Fanon gave is the capital city. All over Africa, there are these capital cities that are imitation of European cities. But European cities were designed for places where it's cold, where heat rises, where you can be in a tall apartment building or a big complex. But African cities historically did not build upward, they built outward because that's a better distribution of heat. African cities may be better if they run on geothermal energy instead of fossil fuel. African cities should be designed for ventilation. African cities should fit the ways of living and distributing movement that are suitable for African physical and cultural environments. So why in the world are these stupid capital cities being built up that I've been in Nairobi, where
You should see it
where
now. It's
where
becoming a
you
fortress.
where you spend
Mm.
an hour and a half to go 1 kilometer in
Mm.
traffic. Makes no damn sense, you know?
And you look
And
at how they build the houses are still built very small with very few amenities, because when Nairobi started, it was for just single male workers. So that model is still informing how housing is built.
it really is. It's just really ridiculous. It
Mm.
needs to be a generation that does for the society something similar to what the young people did when they decided they were not going to sit down and only play, say, European classical music. They created jazz, hip hop, and so forth.
Mm.
There need to be a similar creativity. African people, like people everywhere else, are very creative. We should be doing what really works and fits where we live. And the Europeans quickly realize it's Fela said it very well when you ever listen to Fela's song Gentleman, when he says Fela says, the African gentleman, he put on shoes, he put on wool socks, he puts on a wool coat vest, he put a hat on his head, and then he's dripping sweat and he stinks. In Fela's word, he smells like you know what.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, humanity needs to figure out what really works better for us, including our technologies. A good example is what we're using now.
Mm.
This right now, neoliberalism says we have to be socially distant. That is false. We need to be physically distant. You can be physically distant. You're in Nairobi, I'm in West Hartford, Connecticut. We're physically distant, but we're socially close because we have taken light and sound and transformed into meaning where we could communicate and we could speak.
Mm-hmm.
So we're socially close, but physically distant because of the novel coronavirus. Humanity depends on social closeness, but there are times in our lives where we have to be physically distant. But we have transformed. This was a technology originally designed for spying and using up resources to advertise, and narcissism, all about me, look at my page, blah, blah, blah. But now we need each other, even though we're physically distant, and we've found a way to communicate. We're continuing the human endeavor of power. Communication is power. Power can be negative when you use it to block other people from being empowered, but it can be positive when you use it to empower other people. Because all power is the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so. We have the ability, our speech, our ideas, etc. The condition in this case is a set of things: technology, the computers, electricity, all those things are the conditions. But we made it into a conversation.
I want to go back a little to what you were talking about, the appeal of these neoconservatives to a perfect past. And I know that Fanon warned us about that in The Wretched of. But again, I've become confused because people seem to say some very logical things about Africa still being colonial, but the response is, let's go to the past. I don't know if you had kind of cautioned me against that kind of thinking when we last spoke. So maybe you could elaborate on that. What is the problem with the way that argument is being made?
I wrote a book called Disciplinary Decadence, where I argued the mistake we make is when we make our disciplines godlike. when we treat them as if they're created by gods, and then we treat our methods as if they're created by gods, and we just have to apply our methods. When we fetishize our methods, we no longer pay attention to reality. Well, it's not that we should not look to our past. It's that we should not fetishize it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing. The past is something to learn from. It's not something to entrap ourselves in, because the conditions don't remain the same. In the past, it took nearly, for some groups of people, nearly 1,000 years to travel from one place to another, many generations. Then we got to the point where it took a few years because we had ships and camels and so forth. Then it got to a point where, because of telegraph wires, we could communicate with each other in seconds. Today, we live in a world where if we didn't have the global pandemic, if you wanted to see me or I wanted to see you in person, you or I would be irritated if the trip took more than 24 hours. There's a time to go from where I am to where you are. It took years, then months, then weeks.
Then hours.
Now I could go to Boston or to New York City, and I could be there in under a day. So our world, when space and time shrink, the world gets smaller. Our ancestors lived in a world that was immense, was large, was very different. We live in a world that's small. We live in a world where we realize we're a tiny planet, and it's in a cloud of dust of a bunch of other planets and stars, and stellar objects. And that knowledge means we are in touch with something that requires different kinds of decision. Our ancestors knew quite a bit. African ancestors knew the planet was round. A lot of ancient African ancestors were mathematicians. Earliest mathematicians were female, and there are a lot of reasons for this. And there's a lot of reasons why a lot of early scientists were women. A lot of ancient African words for science were feminine words. In ancient Kemet or Egypt, for instance, or Reket, were mostly female. Okay, and it's from which you get words for science like Rex and Reka. But anyway, I mentioned it so we can learn from that. We can learn from the past about how we're duped. For instance, it's important for me to talk about the fact that the Africans who were enslaved were skilled workers, all right? Because the ideology is to make many African people believe in low African intelligence, and that's just false. So that's a good use of history. It's important in history to know that many people, there are many things from other societies we use. Right now, a good portion of African diets has corn, but corn is not from Africa. It's indigenous people of Abba Yala or the Americas who grew corn and potatoes. And there are many other things. And so the idea is not for us to fetishize the past, but to understand it. However, it's also important to understand the present and the challenges we face. And part of that is understanding that we live in a different world from our ancestors. We have different challenges. And if we remain locked in the challenges of the main challenges that we have that continue from our ancestors is that we continue to rely more on our intelligence than other species. We continue to need shelter. We continue to need food and water. We also connection we have with our ancestors is the knowledge of our fragility. We also, from our ancestors, share an understanding that's in every human myth. If you notice, every society has a story, and the story is this. There was a time when our planet was like paradise. But then we popped up. And when human beings came about, there became the beginning of lies, the first murder, stealing, corruption. In other words, the introduction of imperfection into reality came with us. You see, before us, it's not that the world was perfect. It's that perfection was irrelevant. Before us, lions ate zebras. From the zebra's point of view, that's not perfect. There were droughts. There were asteroids that fell onto the planet. But none of that was about perfection or imperfection. It just was. But when we popped up, we introduced into reality the idea of perfection, which meant there was the idea of imperfection. And our ancestors created stories, myths around those. You notice when we read every ancient myth, every story, they all come down to pretty much the same thesis. This is a story about people trying to get things right. The right wing, the neoconservatives, make the mistake of thinking there was a time when people got things right. If we were to go in a time machine, we'll find that our ancestors were trying to get things right. They never got it right. So what we face today is the same problem our ancestors faced, which is things are not perfect. We have to try to make it better. I don't believe in perfection. I believe that we can get things better. A lot of the things we call perfect is an expression of the best we can achieve under those circumstances. That's all. So to leap into the arms of the past is to leap into old problems and evade our current problems. For instance, our current problems is in a world in which we have taken the position that most, if not all, of humanity deserve to live. Well, under those conditions, it's unacceptable then to go and let millions of people die. So it means we have to do what many scientists just did, many epidemiologists, many biologists, even computer scientists. They all put their research to the side and devoted it all to what they could contribute to what led to the vaccines we now have for COVID-19. Because we've committed ourselves as a species that people should not needlessly die. It's different if accidents occur. But the idea, I'm living in a country where, because of incompetence and the malevolence of the right wing, the incompetence is that they're anti-science. The malevolence is that at the same time, they make sure they get the benefits of science and the other stuff. And then they try to convince people to appeal to religious doctrines that were from the past, while to a situation where now already officially even though it's more than that, but officially more than 350,000 people have died from this virus, 20 million people infected. The list goes on because they were incompetent, narcissistic, malevolent leaders who were encouraging people not to wear masks, encouraging people to ignore the issue of physical distancing, all of those things. So the fact of the matter is, leaders of today need to understand that we don't live in a perfect world, but our best tool to make the world better is our intelligence. We need to use our intelligence, and we need to use our intelligence with a commitment. Frankly, it sounds corny, but to love. In other words, to understand that when somebody suffers and dies, it's not just that an individual suffers and dies, but a beloved member of a community. It's somebody's brother, sister, daughter, son, mother, father, cousin, aunt, best friend. That's who has died. That communities are being shattered from losing the irreplaceable. The same thing when we go in these stupid wars. It's not just about whether we get a piece of land and all that. All of these struggles to get artificially marked areas from colonialism is leading to people's lives disrupted. There are people who woke up one morning in their home and are going to bed on a road as a refugee. That's what people are losing. So we need to use our intelligence matched with compassion, a commitment to love and the understanding. And this is where humility comes in. That it's never simply about ourselves. It's always, every day we get up, the human condition is to face a world greater than ourselves. So we need humility, courage, intelligence, and love.
Wow, you've given me a lot to think about, and also a lot of things that I shall be sharing with some of us Kenyans who are trying to figure out, why are we not able to get out of this? Why aren't we able to think in a way that would help us get out of the mess? And there are so many intellectual blocks, and you've mentioned them. And that's something that we'll think about. So thank you so much. I hope maybe the next time, one of the things I'd like to talk about is trauma, especially and the psychology of being an oppressed people. What has happened to our spirit and our soul? And when I was reading your coming book, that's something that stuck with me a lot. Actually, it's a book of psychology. I don't know if I'm wrong, but it's so psychological what you're talking about. And I think as Kenyans, that's something we've not been able to deal with, because every time we try to reckon with our feelings and our emotions, we are told emotions don't matter. Use reason.
Yeah, that's all false. Yeah, it's to try to turn us into sociopaths, creatures of no affect. Yeah, I mean, for the listeners, the book we're talking about is called Fear of Black Consciousness. It was to come out this year, but because I was very ill, and the editor also was dealing with illness and other things, from the publishing house, and the pandemic led to things shutting down for a while. The book is going to come out in 2022. But it's called Fear of Black Consciousness. And, there are a lot of Black people who are afraid of being conscious, but also a lot of white people who are afraid of Black people being conscious.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Because when you're really conscious, you take political responsibility.
Yeah, you said that.
Yeah. And the other thing you realize is that it's narcissistic to think it's all about you. A lot of people don't realize that we are, the only way the world's going to change is if we roll up our sleeves and do the hard work of changing it.
Mm-hmm.
And like Moses, we may do all the hard work and not enter the promised land. But that doesn't, but that's fine. Because if you act from humility and love, you've set the conditions for others to. And as I always say, if you do your work right, the subsequent generations will look back at you and simply say, thank you, instead of, why the hell didn't you act?
Yes. Yeah. Oh my. Okay. Do you have a blessing for us as our elder? Yeah, a parting blessing.
Well, Judaism is actually, its origins was in East Africa. And you often begin Jewish prayers with Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. And translated, it basically means to bless both the creator, and some people translate it the ruler of the universe. And you notice a lot of our conversation has been about creation, what we need to do. But we talked about rule not as domination, but as setting better standards. Okay? So the blessing that I would offer for everybody is that I wish upon all the earth the courage to take responsibility for the future and to understand with love the irreplaceability of what has been lost, so we can understand how to embrace each other and to work together to make better what is to come. So my blessing to all is to remember the irreplaceability of love, and to grant upon all of us the strength to get up each day and understand the resurging power of faith. And it's simply that.